Now that phase detect is here, how well does Panasonic stack up? And is it finally an option for today's content creation video producer type people? Let's compare against the super popular Sony a7IV. Clearly, Panasonic did not send me an S5 II to try out. I mean, look at these subscriber and view count numbers, Panasonic. Missing out on a crucial demographic of nobody. By the way, you can pre-order the S5 II right now, and B&H says it's going to ship out at the end of January. But if you want the S5 IIX, you can also pre-order, but it's not supposed to ship out until late May. If it were me, I would definitely prefer to get the S5 IIX. It has more features, but we'll kind of talk about the differences and if you can just go for the S5 II if you don't want to wait for the 2X, or if you want to save $200. The main differences between the S5 II and the S5 IIX have to do with internal recording options and external recording options. So let's go ahead and start there in comparing these cameras. The A7IV and the S5 IIX allow you to record internally with long GOP compression as well as all intra, whereas the S5 II base model only has long GOP compression internal recording options. What does that mean? Long GOP is more compressed and it has smaller file sizes. The downfall or the disadvantage is that it potentially is harder to edit with your computer. We'll have a harder time unpacking those compressed files. The image quality is potentially or theoretically less good than the all-intra alternatives. So Sony has XAVC SI internally, and the S5 IIX has all-I options, but also has some ProRes options depending on resolution and frame rates. Those all-intra codecs are easier to edit, but are much bigger files and potentially, theoretically, have higher quality, but in practice, you will almost never see a difference. Okay, let's move on and talk about megapixels. The Sony a7IV has a 7K or 33 megapixel sensor. The S5 II has a 24 megapixel or 6K sensor resolution. However, the a7IV only has 4K recording option, so it's taking that 7K's worth of resolution and squeezing it down into 4K output, whereas on the S5 II, you can shoot all the resolution in the camera at 6K, 5.7K, 4K, 1080p, so way more internal resolution options in the S5 II and the S5 IIX. Both camera systems have internal 10-bit 422. The a7IV has internal 10-bit 422 at all resolutions and frame rate options. You also can shoot 10-bit 420, 8-bit 420. So a lot of options with bit depth and color subsampling with both cameras. S5 II also has 422 10-bit, but if you want to shoot in 6K, I believe that goes down to 420 10-bit. So there are some limitations in terms of maximum quality depending on the resolution, but really when you compare 4K and 1080p, you have the same options on both cameras. I hope you like 16:9 because with the a7IV, that's all you can shoot. If you want to crop to 17:9 or wider, you're going to have to do that in post, whereas on the S5 II, you can shoot 16:9, 17:9, but you can also shoot open gate, which means you get the whole sensor that you can essentially use to output a 3:2 frame size, or you can crop it to 16:9, 17:9, or vertical, or 5:4, 4:5, whatever you want to do with that. You have a ton of options with the S5 II. As for high frame rates in 4K, they're both capped out at 4K 60 and both have an APS-C or 1.5 times crop at 4K 60. The a7IV can shoot 1080p full frame at 120 frames per second, and the S5 II can shoot 1080p full frame up to 180 frames per second. I don't think there's a crop there. Maybe there's a crop, but I know that they can go up to 120 frames per second in full frame. It's kind of a match, although with the S5 II, you do get higher frame rates, but the quality isn't that great. Anyway, neither camera has record limits in 4K, but the S5 II has record limits in 6K. Let's talk about usability, form factor, ergonomics. Both cameras have dual UHS 2 card slots, but the a7IV has a CF Express Type A slot in addition to that. For video, you do not need that CF Express slot on the a7IV. There's no internal recording possibilities that would require that. And I'm actually pretty sure that the fastest card that you need for the a7IV is a V60 card. You don't really even need V90s for this camera. I don't think there's any exceptions to that, but I could be wrong. If you know of one, put it in the comments. Both cameras offer simultaneous backup recording, so you can record to both card slots at the same time, which is really great for event shooters. Not only that, they both have relay recording, which means that when one card fills up, the camera will automatically swap to the second card. And I think they're both hot swappable as well. So for event shooters, again, those are really great options to have. On the other side of the camera, they're both very similar again, having full-size HDMI, which is great. Both have headphone and 3.5 millimeter microphone inputs. The A7 IV has a micro USB, I think that's micro USB, and a USB 3.0 port, whereas the S5 II has only a USB 3.0 port. The addition of the micro USB on the A7 IV isn't that big a deal. Some accessories will utilize that port. However, both cameras can be charged and powered via their USB 3.0 ports. As for battery life, I cannot confirm because I don't have the S5 II, but what I've gathered from watching and reading about the camera, the A7 IV seems to have slightly better battery life. As for ergonomics, again, don't have the S5 II. It seems to be a slightly bigger camera. I've heard that it's very comparable to the GH5 in size, which is bigger than the Sony full-frame cameras. Sony's are known for, or that's kind of Sony's thing, making small cameras, although they have recently started making concessions to reality and making their cameras bigger for real human hands. But again, they're a little bit smaller typically than the competition. I don't have any issues necessarily with the layout of the A7 IV, and the layout of the S5 II, button placement, etc. seems really nice. One potential issue that I've seen people have with Lumix cameras, and I've seen the same thing with the GH5, is the shutter dial, which you can change to something, is very easy to accidentally rotate. So that's something that they should definitely improve, but I guess they keep forgetting to do that. The A7 IV build quality is fine. It's not as good as the A7S III and the higher end cameras from Sony. The differences are very minor. Some of the buttons are a little bit mushier as opposed to clickier or more tactile on the more expensive cameras. The materials seem a little bit cheaper on the grip side of the camera, although it's really hard to quantify exactly what's different. It just feels a little bit less nice, but I don't know how that's going to compare to the S5 Mark II. As for screens, they seem to have identical specifications for the EVFs. They both have 3.6 million dot resolution. The magnification on the S5 II is 0.78 times. It's an OLED screen. I don't know what the refresh rate is, but the A7 IV has the same resolution, and I know it can go up to 120 hertz. They're probably the same. The rear LCD is better on the S5 II. Both are fully articulating. They both are the same size, but the S5 II has more resolution. It's 1.84 million dots, whereas this one is 1.03. It's a pretty big difference. And this screen is also very dim. It's almost completely unusable outdoors, in my opinion. Even things like indoors, like in this scenario right now, I'm looking at my A7S III screen. It's very bright. I can see the record text in red, and I can also see the red outline that I have. When I have this camera in the exact same position, I have to really look hard to make sure it's recording. I really hate the screen on this camera. Overheating, the S5 II has a fan, and that is cool. The A7 IV definitely will have some issues with overheating in certain scenarios. You want to make sure that you turn the high temperature setting on in this camera, but you might still run into some overheating issues if you are in a very hot climate, if you're trying to record for a long time. This camera gets hot to touch. So that's definitely an issue that you will have to manage with this camera. And in certain climates, certain use cases might not be the best option. Whereas with the S5 II having an internal fan, I can't imagine that there's going to be anywhere near as big an issue with that camera and overheating. Let's go ahead and talk about IBIS. Sony's IBIS is okay. It's getting better, but it's not as good as the competition. You've got a couple options off standard, which is basically just the sensor shifting around in the camera body, and active, which adds an electronic stabilization on top of that at the cost of about a 10% crop. The active stabilization does make a huge difference. You also have Catalyst Browse software that you can utilize to get really, really nice results, but there are a lot of downsides to using that software. Just in terms of time, just processing, you should record at a higher shutter speed. It's not for everybody, and it's not like a no-brainer to use that. The IBIS on the S5 II seems to be really, really good. It has the same options, essentially, where it's like off standard where it's just the physical sensor moving, and then an active type mode where it has an additional crop and an electronic stabilization. And it seems really nice. Although if you do look at some footage on really wide angle lenses like 20 millimeters and wider, you will see some significant warpy, wavy stuff in the corners. I don't know, I just feel like that's kind of the way things work. And again, for me, I don't really care. But if you are somebody who really, really likes the best IBIS, I think objectively, the Panasonic has better IBIS. Moving on to autofocus. This is the big one. This is the whole reason we're talking about the S5ii in the first place. Otherwise, nobody cares about Panasonic. This is really great. From what I've seen for these kinds of scenarios where it's just you sitting in front of the camera or even somebody else sitting in front of the camera, relatively stationary, the Panasonic is going to do perfectly well. It seems as if certain scenarios, certain scenes, certain subject matters that may be more complex, the Panasonic system can be thrown off its game more easily, might get confused. Sony's just is more sophisticated. It is more reliable. It's been around for longer. So I think again, it really depends on your use case. For this kind of use case, I think you could go with either one. For live event shooters, I would say the Sony is going to be the better bet because, again, you only have one chance to get the shot. Just like I said, IBIS, objectively, the better system is Panasonic. I would say autofocus, objectively, the better system is Sony. Okay, let's talk about all the features that the S5ii has that the A7IV does not have. Shutter angle, user input LUTs, anamorphic D-squeeze, anamorphic monitoring options in camera, 16:9, 17:9 open gate formats, 6K, 5.7K internal recording, waveforms, vector scopes, dedicated audio menu, true 24p, and some more off-speed, high frame rate options like 48 frames per second internally. I just burped. I think that's it. There might be some more things, but those are the big ones that I can think of, and those are the important ones that matter, I think, to a lot of people. What about features that the A7IV has that the S5ii don't? Focus breathing compensation. The shutter can close to keep dust out. And that's pretty much it. The A7IV can be used as a webcam via USB 3. And I don't think the base S5ii can, but the S5ii can. Let me know if I'm wrong. That is one other potential difference between the cameras. I want to briefly talk about the ecosystem of both systems, really lenses and other camera bodies. Sony has been around for the longest in terms of mirrorless cameras. They have the biggest selection of first-party and third-party lenses. A lot of manufacturers make lenses for Sony. Sigma, Tamron, Viltrox, Rokinon, all those are also autofocus lenses. In addition to all the mechanical, manually focusing lenses out there, you have a ton of options with Sony. On the Panasonic side, they also have a pretty decent lineup, but it just hasn't been around as long, so there's not as many options for first-party lenses. The good thing about Panasonic is not only is Panasonic making first-party lenses, but Sigma and Leica all make first-party lenses as part of this whole L-mount ecosystem. In addition, both systems can be adapted to a variety of older lens formats, Canon EF, Canon F, Nikon G, Nikon F, whatever, and pretty much anything that's a mechanical lens. That could be PL, whatever. They're very adaptable. Sony also has their APS-C lineup of cameras that use the same lens mount. So if you wanted to pair your A7IV with a less expensive APS-C camera, the FX30, or one of the 6000 series cameras, you can buy one of those bodies and use the same lenses on both cameras. Panasonic does not have an APS-C lineup of cameras, and their Micro Four Thirds line uses an entirely different mount, so the lenses are not interchangeable. Really quickly, let me touch on the differences between the S5ii and the S5ii-X, or what the S5ii-X adds. Essentially more internal and external recording options. The S5ii-X has all-eye and ProRes options internally, and you can also shoot external RAW over the HDMI to an Atomos recorder and potentially a Blackmagic recorder, I think. The A7IV and the S5ii base model cannot shoot external RAW. I do think the S5ii base model will have an additional firmware update, paid firmware update that will allow you to do external RAW. Whew, okay, that is a whole lot of I just wanted to lay it out there and kind of give you point for point the differences, the advantages and disadvantages of each one. All in all, I think it's really awesome that Panasonic finally went phase detect. It really has been holding them back from reaching, I think, a threshold of popularity, and I can't wait to see what's coming next for them. It's exciting times. It's always great to have more competition. We're good. We're done. Thanks for watching. I hope that helped you. I hope that was yeah. Okay.